In today's video, we're going to talk all about how not being allowed to express your feelings in childhood and having to stuff your angry feelings can play out in you being somebody who is overly passive aggressive. So let's get into it. Complex PTSD in childhood, as it relates to the parenting dynamic, if you had this experience as it relates to your childhood with your parents, what not being allowed to push back as a child, not being allowed to speak your mind and get angry by being told to go to your room and cry it out and what's wrong with you, or being punished for having feelings because you were rightly so angry at a parent's response, when that's not allowed again and again and again, it can create a tendency to be passive aggressive in your life. So let's talk about the role of passive aggressiveness as it relates to having complex PTSD in childhood. The first thing to know is that, and I'm also referencing everything I'm talking about is from this book, from Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, is that kids are human beings, just like we are. As adults, we forget this, right? We sort of other them. But they get angry and triggered and annoyed, and rightly so. Let's say if you are responding in an extremely unfair way to a child, even a small child, they might not like that. They might push back. Now, let's say that that's the kind of parent you had, and when you tried to push back, you were, like I said, punished, criticized, controlled, sent away, whatever it was, again and again and again. In other words, there was never space for you to have your feelings, right? Or especially negative feelings like crying, being angry. So what we're doing is we're taking an innate, normal response in children and saying, you don't get to have that response because there's a hierarchy here and I'm the adult and you're the child and you don't get to do that. And so what happens when that happens again and again and again in family systems is that children learn to repress and stuff the anger they feel. They can't safely express it. There is no world in many homes in which a child being mad at you, and sometimes rightly so, sometimes not, there are many places, especially historically, where that was not allowed. And so what happens is that kids stuff these things again and again and again. These things, meaning their angry feelings. And the stuffed emotion is just kind of silently lurking deep within. And it's looking for a place to kind of come up, but when we're in childhood or with our certain types of caregivers, it can't. So it might look like it's disappeared, but really it is very much present within many of us. And what happens is it often becomes the root of resentment, of learning that direct expression of anger is not safe. I can't say, yeah, I'm mad at you because you blah, 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 right? That wasn't allowed. Or, I didn't like it that you said whatever. That didn't happen. And so what happens is that it's kind of swirls inside this repressed state of having to always stuff the feelings, and it manifests in oftentimes the outer critic, becoming critical of everyone else. It's a way to kind of offload and dump those angry feelings, that deeply repressed rage or anger that you couldn't have. And so what often happens is that it starts to pop up, and what we're trying to do is really protect ourselves with these feelings we have of anger, with this technique of criticizing everyone else, right? No one's ever good enough. And there's always going to be someone who's going to be betraying you or dishonest with you. And it's basically searching for fault and finding the potential danger in those things happening in everyone else. So it's serving a purpose. It's helping you manage your fears deep inside, and it's also keeping you kind of, stuck inside holding those feelings. And what happens is that the outer critic views all relationships, Pete says, through the lens of what I would say potential parental abandonment. Now, the abandonment might mean physical, emotional. It could mean the abandonment of safety, of security, of safe attachment in some way, of stability. But the role the outer critic is taking is starting to serve a very strong purpose because it sees everyone and everything as potential danger. So what this does is it allows us to repeatedly and continuously take those angry feelings and the fear of danger and put that on everyone and everything else. So we silently scapegoat others by blowing things out of proportion, by making them a bigger deal, See, it's working to protect us, and it's also helping us offload those feelings that we were never allowed to offload. And one of the ways it can do that is through being passive aggressive. So what happens is when silently holding that in becomes a technique, a process for you again and again and again, and you aren't allowed to directly express that anger, and or even after childhood, you don't know how, or maybe you take too much in blow, or maybe you're a rager. But when all of those things aren't an option and you've learned that the only avenue you have is passive aggressiveness, it's such a great way to try to offload and to also protect. So what are some examples of passive aggressiveness? Number one, distancing when you feel hurt by somebody, but not really telling them why, right? So you sort of remove yourself, but don't communicate. And they read it as, are they mad at me? Did I do something wrong? But you're like, no, it's almost like it's a little crazy making for the other person, because you distance to protect, but don't explain why. And you push others away, but maybe you push just far enough where they can feel something's off, but you don't really address it or deal with it. Number two, it can come out in backhanded compliments, right? So it's like, oh, that looks great, or whatever it is, but there's this layer of passive aggressiveness that can be really difficult to detect. And I think you can get really good at it, this sort of nuance, especially in really sarcastic families where sarcasm and being passive aggressive is a very strong way of communicating. It's just like a second, it's like you just fall back into that, like it's a second language for you. It can also show up in not really listening to people, being like somebody who jokes and teases a lot, and then being like, I'm just joking, like whatever. My big issue with this is often I see, especially in friendship groups with kids who are in the same friend groups, where they make really rude comments or jokes, or they say they're teasing, but it's actually really hurtful information they're sharing. It can be withholding positive feedback or gratitude or appreciation. So someone does something for you, but you intentionally don't share it because you don't want to give them that win. Or it could be that you're still mad at them and over something, and you're not going to, even though they did something really wonderful for you, you're kind of holding a grudge there. It can be being chronically late, so like no real regard for somebody. We all have these issues, I understand, for different reasons. I'm not suggesting if you're chronically late that you're doing it on purpose to be passive aggressive, but over time, if you know that it's disrespectful to people who want you to be there on time, you are doing something that you're not correcting and changing, and it's being experienced as like a way to push back, or low key, or even high key aggression, or not following through on things you say you're going to follow through on and then not addressing it. It can be false promises. So you promise to do things or say things. It's almost like that false self of yours takes over, the false self that's all about protecting and distancing for safety. And it can also be basically like not being your real self. And so you don't even know who that person is, but all you know how to do is express your displeasure, your resentment, your fear of engulfment, danger, whatever, through being this other version of yourself. And it can be really difficult, like I'm saying, especially if that was your family pattern. So if this is you and you're like, yeah, this was my family system, or I do this a lot and I don't really want to, what can you do? The first thing is to understand and have some compassion for yourself about why you adopted this role, to reflect on your childhood. How did my parents respond when I was upset? Would they ever validate me? Would they always invalidate or disregard me? Was I punished? Going back to, if you want something to cry, I will give you something to cry about, right? So, or how dare you be angry at an appropriately angry thing as a child, but instead you lost privileges or whatever. So try to reflect on kind of how that was managed. The next thing is to explore what role does focusing on other people never being enough, not good enough, not smart enough, not fast enough, whatever it is, what is that doing in your life? What is that doing for you? And what is it doing in relationship to others? Then once you do that, you want to learn to start pausing and catching yourself when you do that. So when you make a sarcastic comment or passive aggressive comment, to pause and be like, oh, God, I didn't really like how I said that. Let me try to rephrase that. Let me not just defend and push back and disregard you, but let me pause and say something that is actually validating, or maybe it honors your anger to say, you know what? I just made a joke about that, but I'm actually not okay with that. And here's why, which I know can take a lot of work, but we're trying to switch the narrative because what we're really doing is avoiding any risk of being abandoned by thinking we're going through the back door of communication, but really we're not. I'm sure you know people who you've pushed away from because they're just negative all the time or passive aggressive. Like, there's a limit to that. It's still aggressive. Passive doesn't change the fact that it's still aggressive. You want to restate things like I said. You might journal about the daily ways this shows up in your life, trying to catch yourself, trying to make more positive affirmations and statements, looking at, well, what do other people do that feels passive aggressive? Because sometimes that can help us get to what we're doing. Oh, I get really triggered when someone does this kind of thing, but maybe I do that too. So trying to hold yourself accountable to that. And looking at going back to, like I said, honoring why you do it and how it developed, to have some compassion so that when you do it and you catch yourself, or maybe you caught yourself, but you just didn't have the courage to redo the statement and now you're beating yourself up, to recognize that every time you beat yourself up and shame yourself, you're taking yourself way back into that childhood, inner child role that says you deserve that shame, that something is bad or wrong about you, and therefore, or others, you need to keep distancing and feeling bad about yourself and pushing others away. And then to do things like just trying to practice having that communication skill you want to work on. Maybe you take a communications class or get some books on how to self-advocate, how to express yourself. You make repairs when you say something and you're like, that wasn't great. That was actually sarcastic and passive aggressive. I don't care if it's the next day. You can go to the person and say, hey, I'm not okay with that thing that happened with you, but it wasn't okay, but what's not okay is how I handled it. And I'd like to apologize and say, I'm sorry about that. Let's talk about some other ways to resolve this problem, right? So it takes a lot of practice and skill. And sometimes you have to do the work. Pete Walker talks about angering and crying. We can get to more of those, but finding ways to purge out. Maybe the anger that you've held it needs to come out. It needs to come out in journaling. It needs to come out in watching movies or listening to music and angry songs. I love to talk in the car about things like by myself when I'm really mad. I used to do this a lot. It doesn't happen that much anymore. I mean, it does, but not like it did in the years of a lot more drama and conflict with situations where I'd be in the car and I'd just say the things I wish I could say. And I still do this, like I'm saying, but sometimes just hearing yourself say things out loud and getting to say the thing that you know you can't say can be helpful. But if you do that, that doesn't mean that getting it out in the car, angering, necessarily repairs the parts where you're still acting out the passive aggressiveness. So you still have to work on those actual skills, but also honoring that the feelings that you had in childhood and the ones you have now, they were valid then and they are valid now. And the only way to not keep reenacting that childhood is to start to do something different today. So, hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.